Today on Straight Talk Africa, Liberia's Supreme Court Monday indefinitely delayed the presidential runoff and ordered the Electoral Commission to resolve an opposition party's complaint for fraud before the runoff can be held. The decision throws the country's first democratic transition in 7 decades into uncertainty. That's coming up next right here on Straight Talk Africa. Today, it's the significance of the Liberian Supreme Court decision to indefinitely delay Tuesday's presidential runoff.
Coming up later, you've weighed in on our topic through emails, Facebook and Twitter comments. We'll reveal some of them ahead, right here on Straight Talk Africa.
The Liberian Supreme Court on Monday decided to indefinitely delay presidential runoff that had been scheduled for Tuesday until the Electoral Commission investigates allegations of fraud in the October 10th election. My colleague Paul Cisco has more.
The Liberian Supreme Court on Monday indefinitely postponed Tuesday's presidential runoff election, citing concerns of fraud in the first round. In its ruling, Chief Justice Francis Sekor Poor said the Electoral Commission was acting wrongly and illegally in proceeding with the runoff, as there was still a complaint pending about the first-round vote in October.
Given the critical nature of the complaint subject of these proceedings and its implication on the governance of the nation, the NEC is directed to give urgent attention to the expeditious hearing and determination thereof. It is so ordered.
The two leading candidates, Senator and former football star George Weah and Vice President Joseph Boakai, were set to participate in the runoff until third-place finisher Charles Brumskine filed a legal challenge alleging widespread fraud. The court says a new date cannot be scheduled until the complaint is resolved.
I consider myself blessed, my friends, to be a part of this collective effort to stop and undo the grievous offense that has been meted out against the Liberian people.
The first round of voting took place on October 10th. George Weah garnered 39% of the vote, while President Sirleaf's Vice President Joseph Boakai got 29% of the votes cast. No candidate reached the 50% plus one vote barrier for an outright win. The runoff was to be held Tuesday, November 7th. This will be the first time Liberia hands over power democratically, with incumbent President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf stepping aside. Her second term ends in January. Sirleaf firmly denies third-party accusations of meddling and rigging the October 10th general and presidential elections. Sirleaf was awarded the Nobel Prize in 2011, just days before her re-election, and is credited for keeping the peace after the prolonged civil war that ended in 2003. She brought Liberians through the devastating Ebola crisis, and supporters say has restored lost hope to the Liberian people. Critics say her administration has been corrupt and that it has done little for the impoverished Liberian people.
In 2005, he had 29%. The Unity Party had 19%, and we overcame that gap to win the presidency with Madam Sirleaf, and we think we can still do that this time around.
The CDC is made of young people, most of them below the age of 35. And this is something they have devoted lives to. These are suffering young people. They devoted their life to this thing, they continue to devote their life to this thing, they put themselves into these elections.
This country is a free land that everybody wants to enjoy. I do not have fear in me because Liberians are people that do not want problems. Liberians, we have fought 14 good years of civil war in this country, and we have realized what they have done to us. So for now, I don't think any Liberian is contemplating on having confusion in this country no longer.
I'm confident with the court of the Supreme Court of this country, and I know once it's in the hands of Supreme Court, that will be peaceful.
I'm not worried. I know there'll be a solution. I'm not worried.
The Supreme Court's order for a full investigation into the complaint suggests the delay could be longer than just the few days many expected. No new date has been given for the runoff vote. Paul Cisco, VOA News, Washington.
Thanks, Paul, for that report. Joining us here in the studio are three distinguished guests. my colleague James Bate, Managing Editor, VOA's Daybreak Africa, Alan White, former Chief of Investigation Special Court in Sierra Leone, and John Tomaszewski, Africa Regional Director, International Republican Institute. I'm sorry, John, if I have probably murdered your name, really.
No problem, Shaka.
Well, I have to say frankly that I am profoundly honored and exceedingly humbled to have the three of you on Straight Talk Africa, especially the two of you for the first time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, my pleasure.
You're most welcome. Later in the program, we'll give our audience a chance to call in with your question or comment. The number to call is 202-619-3111, and the US country code is 1. Let me come to you immediately. James, you first of all happen to be a native or a citizen of Liberia itself.
A native Liberian.
A native Liberian,
Thank you.
You happen to cover it so very, very closely. I can't frankly think about any other person that has had that sort of coverage on Liberia in the last so many years that we've been together here at the Voice of America.
Thank you, and I think that's the right choice you made. Thank you also for inviting me again on your show.
It's a pleasure. Now tell us, what is the significance of this Supreme Court ruling, really?
Very significant, as Mr. Bromsky himself told me, Charles Bromsky of the Liberty Party, the one that is leading the complaint, that this has never happened before in the history of Liberian elections. So it's very, very significant. As you know, you've been following as we cover it. The court, there were complaints after the first round vote on October 10th. And Charles Bromsky's Liberty Party and three other parties complained to the Elections Commission that there were some irregularities. They call it massive irregularities. Also to the point that they thought this violated the country's constitution. So they took a complaint to the Elections Commission. Apparently, the Elections Commission should have given them a ruling, review their case, their complaint, and given them a ruling. Apparently, that did not happen. So they went to the Supreme Court of Liberia, and the court, faced with all these complaints, because Bromsky was joined by the ruling party, the Unity Party, which is led by the current vice president and two other parties. So the court was pushed in a position to make a decision. So it decided that instead of the Election Commission scheduling a runoff, which the commission was doing, it was following the Constitution. There's nothing in the Liberian Constitution that talks about when someone challenges the results of the first round. The Constitution only says that after the first round, the top two candidates will go to a runoff. There's no provision for when someone challenges.
Are you suggesting, therefore, that this move is in fact unconstitutional as far as Liberia is concerned?
They moved by by the Supreme Court?
Yeah.
But the court was pushed to make a decision. So therefore, it told the Elections Commission to hold a stay on the runoff election, which should have taken place on November 7th. There should be a stay until the Election Commission can investigate the complaints.
Very interesting.
Which is going to happen now. The commission is going to do that.
Investigate itself?
Well, the commission has constitutional responsibility to do that. There's a review board on the commission to do that.
Very interesting. John, you happen to be a lawyer, and you just got back from Liberia. Is that correct?
Actually, I am, and I'm not an attorney, but I have a PhD in criminal justice.
Right.
So I've been involved in the criminal justice system for more years than I would like to state, but I've spent a lot of time. Just for the record, my interest in Liberia, as the Chief of Investigations for the UN-backed War Crimes Tribunal in Sierra Leone, we were responsible for investigating and prosecuting those who bear the greatest responsibility for the Civil War.
Right.
While directing those investigations, it took me directly to Charles Taylor and his support for aiding and abetting the RUF. And that started in 2002, and as you know, we were able to successfully...
That was the Revolutionary United Front of Foday Sankoh.
That's correct, Foday Sankoh, and he was supportive of that and actually created the RUF back in the 1990, and of course in March of 1991 they launched the civil war in Sierra Leone, which he was responsible for. He was not convicted for anything that happened in Liberia. However, as soon as we unsealed the indictment for his arrest for war crimes in June of 2003, I immediately went over to the country after he left in exile in August 11th, 2003, to start conducting investigations in Liberia. And I fell in love with the country, and I fell in love with the people. And of course, you know the close historical ties that we have. And I've remained in contact with a large majority of these people for the past 15 years. So I have an affinity for not only the region, but particularly Liberia and Sierra Leone. And I recently came back from Liberia after being invited over by some very senior people to ask me to come over and give an honest assessment of what they thought was going on as related to the elections.
Were those senior people Liberian?
Yes, yes.
Can you name names?
Well, I don't really want to name names right now, but I certainly met virtually everybody that's part of the four coalition parties that are protesting this. And it's not a question of supporting any one of them, it's about supporting the rule of law and whether or not these are free and fair elections. And having put my life on the line in that part of the country where Charles Taylor had tried to kill me in the past, I feel I have some standing to help bring peace and security and stability and ensure to the extent that I can, for my love of the country, the rule of law.
The reason I asked that question, Alan, is because there are some people who feel that you may in fact have a horse in this particular race.
Well, the only horse that I have right now is ensuring that the rule of law is followed. And I've always been about retributive justice, pursuing anti-corruption. That's what I've been doing for the past 15 years, traveling around the world, setting up anti-corruption programs, and also ensuring where there's retributive justice where possible.
What do you think about, George Weah's running mate, who happens to be a former wife of President Taylor, Charles Taylor?
Well, it's deeply concerning, not only to me, but if you listen to the hearings, congressional hearings that were held last month, the U.S. Congress, as well as the Acting Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, as well as USAID Assistant Administrator for Africa, all voiced their concerns about any effort or any person bringing back a convicted war criminal for committing atrocities that impacted 1.2 million victims and over 250,000 deaths of Liberians. Why would anyone want to link back to those dark times and bring back somebody like that? Because there was some discussion that had been previously reported and confirmed that George Weah had in fact talked to former President Taylor from his prison cell in the UK. And that has been confirmed. It was confirmed by the U.S. government, and the UK authorities confirmed that as well. So there was an effort to infuse his beliefs back into Liberian politics, which he was prohibited from doing by the agreement when he left and he went into exile. So it's very troubling that anyone or any person or any effort to bring back a convicted war criminal that would be a threat to not only Liberia, but to the entire region would be absolutely incredulous in my mind.
Do these officials feel that George Weah is not his own man? Doesn't he have the right to talk with anybody?
He does, and certainly that's a fair comment. But the point is, there was so much money, time, and effort spent by the international community, not the least of which was the United States government, taxpayers' money, to help bring peace and security to that region. And that was done not at the request of the West, but it was done, people forget this, but on June 4th of 2000, President of Sierra Leone requested that a war crimes tribunal be set up in his country. And he knew full well where that would end up. So it was an African head of state that requested this tribunal to the Secretary General, Kofi Annan, at that time, to set up a war crimes tribunal. And that's what's happened. So There was a lot of money spent to bring peace and security to the region. So the thought of bringing back someone that publicly went on a mobile phone telephone call anticipating and inciting violence, that if you don't support that ticket, go back to your home base and vote for these people or incite violence, that's amazing.
But is there any clause under the Liberian constitution, for example, that prohibits anybody, for example, to talk to former President Charles Taylor?
No, absolutely not. And there's no question that it's not a question of violation of law. It's a question of whether or not the Liberian people, and it's up to them at the end, do they want somebody that has links or wants to have links with a former convicted war criminal and bring back the policies of the former MPP. Now, Joe Howard Taylor is a little over a month ago was up north in the country, in Nimba Forest area, espousing that they wanted to continue the MPP policies that her husband had started, but he was unable to finish because he was arrested and prosecuted by the international community. So this isn't something that I'm saying. This is something that has been publicly reported and things that she has said.
But isn't that the business, frankly, of the Liberian voters, really?
You're absolutely right.
That's exactly what I think we should talk about.
So let me go to John first before coming to you to weigh in. Joe, you've obviously been listening to your fellow panelists. What is your reaction to what you just had?
Well, I was actually in Kenya during the Liberian elections, and I've just come from a process also.
The elections, some call them in fact selections.
Selection, it depends on who you are, on the political divide, I suppose. But also in that case, right, the Supreme Court weighed in and made an unprecedented decision to annul the presidential election. Of course, that's not what we're talking about here in Liberia. I mean, listen.
But the Liberian decision, too, happens to be unprecedented.
Of course, unprecedented, but perhaps also a signal that institutions are independent. And becoming increasingly so. This is not something we would have seen 10 years ago, 20 years ago in Africa, and I think it says a lot about the democratic transformation that is occurring in these countries, where institutions feel and also have the room to make such decisions, whether you agree with them or not. It allows for a space for that discussion to take place, and I think that's a good sign. I would say in terms of the Charles Taylor stuff, listen, the Liberians voted, and of course there is an investigation ongoing to see if some of these irregularities that were pointed out in Brumskim's petition are true or not. And then there is also an appeals process where if you don't feel like you received a good shake by the Electoral Commission, you can go and appeal that decision, and that can be talked about in the Supreme Court. But the Liberians voted, and they voted for George Weah, and and they voted for Vice President Boakai, and they did so in the knowledge of some of this information, and they're politically literate. They know what they wanted.
Precisely.
And we have to understand and respect that. We don't always get who we want. I will go back to the Kenya election in 2013, where former Ambassador Johnny Carson said choices have consequences, right?
Correct,
and
correct.
choices are made.
Correct.
And people make choices even if they know the consequences. So it's important for us to put it in the context of the Liberians have made a decision, and we have to talk about it in that context.
It's very interesting that you keep saying that the Liberians have voted. The Liberians have voted. I can imagine Kenyan President Uhuru Muigai Kenyatta saying exactly the same thing, that the Kenyan voters have voted. His Deputy President William Ruto saying exactly the same thing.
Yes, absolutely.
The Kenyan people have spoken. They have voted. But of course, we know what happened September 1st by the Kenyan Supreme Court.
Yes.
That in fact we should probably not even think that the event of August the 8th actually even occurred at all, because obviously they found illegalities and irregularities.
Yes.
So does this mean that perhaps we should actually wait to hear from the Liberian Supreme Court?
Well, elections are a process. We're in the middle of a process. voting is not just the only part of the process. The process also includes candidates to raise issues, which they have. There's a due process of reviewing that, doing that. And then if everything goes forward, then there'll be a runoff. If not, then we'll be having a further discussion.
Very interesting.
And that is all part of it.
Very interesting. James, as you cover Liberia, and of course you have covered it very, very extensively, do you hear some of those concerns on the ground? I mean, from the ordinary Liberian people? Do they really care whether or not anybody that is allied or probably even speaks or talks to former Liberian President Charles Taylor? Do they really care about whether or not they can actually choose that particular individual for the highest office in the land or not?
I think you're right. I do speak to all the candidates, all the major players. I speak to them. I've spoken to the vice president, spoken to Charles Bromsky many times. I can pick up the phone and talk to them to hear what they're talking about, because I want to have them on my show, let the Liberian people know what they're saying. Though people will do risk assessment, look at the current situation, since everybody's talking about the rule of law, let the process play out. Now the Elections Commission has the case. It has to make a ruling back to the complainant. If they don't like it, then they go to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court will have to come in and rule. And once that ruling takes place, everybody's assuming that there's going to be a runoff. They will reschedule a runoff. I think risk assessment, I was listening this morning to a video sent to me last night when Weah was addressing his supporters impromptu, and he was talking about the fact that, I mean, people say here in that video, he referred to those people complaining now as troublemakers, but he was going back to the last two elections, 2011, 2005, because the position that we find the ruling party in now, we as party was in that position. It was in the second place.
Second place.
Now, this time around, Weah is in the lead.
But isn't it true that the ruling party, as we talk, is split? Because let's face it, the incumbent president, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, did not endorse her deputy, her vice president. And in fact, the last time I checked, the vice president himself has actually been trying to distance himself from the incumbent president.
Yeah, I mean, you can say that, but there are several scenarios out there why, because I was in Liberia, and I sat down with the vice president and I asked him, would you like the president to openly come and support you? And he did not openly say that he would like for the president. He only said that he would welcome all partisans of the ruling Unity Party. They have a choice to declare their support or not.
But he did not answer your question.
Yeah, but which indicated to me that there were some problems, and there are some explanations that people gave. One explanation is that perhaps the president might have asked for some support from the vice president. Says, let's assume the vice president wins the election.
You mean they may have wanted to cut a deal?
Yeah, cut a deal or whatever. Then and protect her and her son. And so then the thing is that I think somebody told me, well, then the vice president asked, oh, what did you do or what did your son do for which you might want protection? So that's one scenario. The other scenario could be that the president just doesn't want to get herself involved directly. Maybe she wants to just stay on the sideline. So whichever one you believe, that's what is happening. I was thinking that, because I left Liberia September 15, I was thinking that the vice president was going to launch his campaign that Saturday. And so I asked, is the president going to be there at the launch of the official launch of the campaign in Monrovia, the capital? That night, the president gave us one of the TV and said that, oh, in fact, that she was not going to be there. In fact, she went on her farm. So you can see with all these developments, there's some problem.
There are some problems.
There's a problem right now.
If you listened or watched the package by my colleague or our colleague Paul Cisco, it ends on the note of talking about how, for example, the government of incumbent President Sirleaf is charged with corruption. There are a lot of people, frankly, who say that it didn't quite deliver really what it set out to do. Would it be surprising, therefore, that somebody who actually has been the deputy of incumbent president would want to essentially stay away from identifying with this person because that person wants to win an election? Just like in the case, for example, of Al Gore,
yes,
vice president of Bill Clinton, following the Lewinsky affair back in 2000. What about that?
I don't disagree at all. I think that he's tried to, at least from what I've read, he's tried to distance himself from the administration. And if I could pick up on something that James just mentioned, this was one of the reasons why I went over to Liberia. As you know, my background is criminal investigations, getting the truth, the rule of law. That's really what I care about. It's not.
Do you actually end up getting the truth?
I get the truth, and this is if it's not evidence that we're able to put Charles Taylor behind bars for creating and aiding and abetting the atrocities. That was a very difficult situation to do in Liberia and actually in West Africa, and we did it. We followed the rule of law, we presented evidence, but you gather facts. So whatever people tell you, you have to always verify and check it. So this is what I heard, and he mentioned it, and it's not a question of whether it's WIA or it's Brumskin or whoever it may be. It's a question of following the facts. And these allegations surfaced to me. This is what I was asked. It's been reported significantly the corruption of the current administration, from the money that was allegedly embezzled from the National Oil Commission, from a full accounting of the Ebola funding. I've talked to people, the Ministry of Health said that the money came in there, but the NGOs that I've talked to said they never saw any money. It's not a question of casting aspersions, but there's been this simmering of corruption allegations for a long time. So to cut to the chase, what I was told by an individual that talked directly to one of her sons, the president's sons, was that what the deal that was cut with WIA is, number one, that he would never come after him for any political corruption or graft, first of all. Second of all, there would be no war crimes tribunal. As you all know, in the TRC, there is reference. I know all too well what her involvement was and what it wasn't. And that's not what I'm here to talk about today. But thirdly, which is a very important issue, is that her son Robert had run for political office before and was defeated soundly.
By WIA.
So WIA had promised, so I'm told, and I talked to people and confirmed to the extent that I believe there to be some validity to it.
But do you
that
consider that type of evidence, frankly, incontrovertible, not liable to falter?
Since you're asking me, and this was brought up, I have not yet proven. I'm just telling you what I was able to uncover, but that the vacated seat of his position in Montserrado County, he would appoint.
Not appoint. He would get his supporters.
He would
get his supporters, because there's nothing that when it comes to votes that Robert Sirleaf has, but WIA has votes when it comes to Montserrado County. So if there's any deal at all, that could be there. That's where WIA will come in.
Very interesting, very interesting. But you know, Alan, again about you talked about, of course, how you go for the facts, you go for the truth, justice. What about people who will say, when you went after Charles Taylor, this was a case or an issue of what these people characterize as selective justice? In fact, they say there are other African leaders in the Great Lakes region who have killed or are responsible to actually kill more than that 1.2 million people that you talked about, and nothing has happened to them. Have you heard about that?
Of course, we've always heard about that, and if it were up to me, I would go after all of these people. Unfortunately,
you had the ICTR in Arusha.
No, I was
spending so much money on really what turned out to be victor's justice. Not justice, really.
Well, candidly, this was one of the reasons why the tribunal that we were a part of was established. It wasn't a UN created, it was a UN backed. But people felt that justice was not necessarily received by the ICTY and the ICTR. So they